Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. The topic for today's webinar is State of the U.S. Energy Storage Industry 2021 Year in Review. This is an annual webinar that we do, and it's always a really exciting topic for us, so thank you all for being here. This webinar is being presented by the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Before we get into it, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen. And you can also click on that arrow to expand your webinar console. One of the things that you might like to do with that webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar. We have an hour and a half total for this webinar, and we're hoping to save plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. We do have quite a lot of people registered for this popular annual webinar, so I think we'll have a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to yours, type it in when you think of it. Don't necessarily wait until the very end to type your questions in. A final note, we are recording this webinar. We will email you within about 48 hours with a copy of the recording and a PDF of the slides. And we'll also post those on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's also where you can find information about all of our archived and upcoming webinars. So with that, I'll now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, my colleague Val Stori. Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone. Yes, I am Val Stori, Project Director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, otherwise known as CESA, and I'm happy to be moderating today's conversation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with CESA, we are a nonprofit organization headquartered in Montpelier, Vermont, that works with state energy offices and related agencies across the U.S. And we work with these members to advance clean energy policies, programs, and innovations. And we primarily focus and put an emphasis on renewable energy, energy storage, which we're here to talk about today, resiliency, and energy equity. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is part of the CESA DOE Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, otherwise known as STAP. And STAP, the project, focuses on energy storage. It is work conducted under contract to Sandia National Laboratories, and it is a program and partnership funded by the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. And we at CESA, under STAP, we do three key activities, which you can see on your screen. One, we facilitate information sharing, such as through the STAP webinar series. And it's come to my attention that we have nearly a decade of webinar recordings on the CESA website, which Sam referenced not too long ago. So if you're interested in a specific energy storage topic, chances are you will find a webinar on said topic on our webinar page. We also support state energy storage efforts through technology, policy, and program assistance. And then we work with Sandia and the DOE to identify and facilitate the development of jointly supported energy storage demonstration projects, some of which you can see up on your screen now. Next page, next slide. Thank you, Sam. So this partnership and this program would not be possible without two people whom I'd like to thank today, Dr. Imre Gyuk, whom you'll be hearing from today, and I'll introduce him momentarily, and Dan Borneo, who works at Sandia National Laboratories, where he's the engineering project and program lead. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, I'll be introducing Dr. Gyuk, who is one of today's speakers, as well as John Fernandez, Senior Consultant at Customized Energy Solutions. I'm going to introduce Dr. Gyuk now, and then I will introduce John right before his presentation. So welcome, Dr. Gyuk. We are so lucky to have you here today opening up this STAP webinar. For those of you who don't know Dr. Gyuk, he's an internationally recognized leader in the energy storage field. His work has led to 11 R&D 100 awards, 2 EPA Green Chemistry Challenge awards, and a Lifetime Achievement Award. For the past 2 decades, he has directed the Electrical Energy Storage Research Program at DOE's Office of Electricity, developing a wide portfolio of storage technologies for a broad spectrum of applications. He supervised the $185 million ARA stimulus funding for the grid-scale energy storage demonstrations and is now partnering with states on numerous storage projects for grid resiliency. He has a BS from Fordham University, and he received his PhD in theoretical particle physics from Purdue. Dr. Gyuk, I will pass it to you now to kick us off.
Okay, well, thank you, Val, for the introduction. And well, as you know, we have the annual review today. But first, I want to notice that despite COVID, storage deployment continued to grow at a fast clip. And we should remember to thank the men and women who actually constructed these facilities in the face of COVID. Having a skilled workforce will be absolutely essential for the future. And countries around the world are beginning to realize that, both developed and developing countries, that this is going to be the workforce of the future, along with solar energy and other new technologies. Now, as far as storage is concerned, we are seeing bigger and bigger installations. 40, 50 megawatt facilities are becoming commonplace. Not to mention really big 300 megawatt giants like Moorabool in Australia and Moss Landing in California. However, these facilities are mostly not longer in duration. Nonetheless, medium and long duration storage is very much in focus. We all know that we will need it as much as more renewable generation comes online. So there are any number of conferences and webinars on the subject, and any number of companies are trying to gear up and doing research on medium and long duration storage. Along this line, there is a growing interest in flow batteries and also in non-electrochemical long duration storage, thermal, gravity, what have you. The California Energy Commission is already field testing a number of these new technologies, and DOE will soon follow, or at least hopefully so. There's also a lot of interest in social equity. Many utilities are realizing the importance of recognizing all their customers. Energy storage can play an important role in providing the needs of less affluent customers. Here at DOE, we have just started our Energy Storage for Social Equity program with 14 urban, rural, and tribal communities. And we will work with these communities for a year to figure out what their real needs are and how energy storage can help them. And then we will down select a few projects and do actual storage installations. I also need to mention the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which contains very substantial funds for energy storage and specifically calls for longer duration storage and social equity projects. So 2021 was a great year for storage, and 2022 will be even more so. And now we have our speaker for the STAP's annual review, John Fernandez from Customized Energy Solutions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gyuk. Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce John Fernandez, a senior consultant at Customized Energy Solutions. Will share his bio with you in a moment. Similar to what Dr. Gyuk has just queued up for us, John's presentation is going to go deep into a 2021 review. He's going to touch upon installation and deployment trends in the US. He's going to talk about how rules are developing in different ISOs, RTOs, including new provisions for managing hybrid resources and allowing them to participate in market dispatch and market awards. He's going to cover effective load carrying capabilities across different resource and different asset types. And if there is time or in the Q&A session, we can touch upon policy drivers like the Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard, supply chain disruptions, battery recycling, and of course, the potential for green hydrogen for energy storage should there be time. So, John, welcome. John joined Customized Energy Solutions after nearly 5 years in the development, construction, and IPP sectors, managing policy and creating new market opportunities across renewable, fossil, transmission, and energy storage business lines. Prior to his time in the commercial space, he was on staff at FERC and was a regulatory manager for an investor-owned utility. He has global experience in international markets, including Canada, Mexico, Africa, and Southeast Asia. He holds an MBA from the University of Delaware, a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins University, and he is also a guest lecturer at the University of Colorado at Denver's Global Energy Management Program. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Val. Thanks for the introduction. And as always, thanks to CESA for the opportunity to present here. Val, just real quick. Oh, wait, there we go. Slides are moving.
I saw them move. Yep, and I'm just going to interject. Okay. Don't forget, audience, to please type in any questions using the question dialog box. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And Dr. Gyuk, as always, thanks for providing some background here. Always great to hear your perspective. John Fernandez with the Emerging Technologies Group at Customized Energy Solutions. Just real quick, make the marketing folks happy. We are a very market-centric consulting firm. And when I say markets, I'm specifically talking about the ISOs and RTOs of North America. Our largest team is the Market Intelligence Group. They sit in on really every ISO stakeholder meeting that takes place every day. We have shoplifted ISO staff from, I know, at least 5 of the markets. So really in-depth knowledge of what's happening in those areas across North America. The other group I like to highlight, very unique for a company like CES, we are a scheduling coordinator in all the markets in North America. We have a 24-hour operations center, 18 stories up in downtown Philadelphia. So we're not an investor, we're not a developer, we don't take financial positions in projects. We schedule these resources on behalf of our clients into the markets. And so I kind of quip, we're all market design experts at CES, but it's really nice to be able to go to these guys and say, okay, how are these resources really being used? How are they getting paid outside of what it says in the tariffs? And then my group, Emerging Technologies, you know, the past 5 years, that has been almost exclusive battery storage in terms of emerging tech. And for today's purposes, given time and priorities, that's really what we're going to be focusing on is grid scale electrochemical batteries in the markets. But there's been plenty of activity, and CES, we cover electric vehicles. You heard Dr. Gyuk mention other technology platforms that are out there. And then another one, kind of my mention for the day, is hydrogen. A quickly developing space. We have actually staffed up specifically to support hydrogen research around the globe. We are executing some of these research projects in international markets. And some pretty cool announcements recently of projects and assessments that are taking place around the US. So hydrogen is kind of the shiny new thing, but it definitely is a thing. and it's going to be really interesting to see what role hydrogen plays in the energy space and possibly as a storage platform when it comes to energy. Okay, so at the highest level, what we're seeing in terms of storage development, storage deployment. So you see the dividing line there, kind of the 2020, 2021 timeframe, and then moving forward. There are gigawatts, double-digit gigawatts of energy storage in really every interconnection queue across the US. It is growing rapidly. Like Dr. Gyuk said, really, COVID did not slow anything down. We CES, we talk to investment banks and equity firms as much as we talk to developers these days. There is a lot of funding coming into this space. The other noteworthy item on this slide, if you look down to the bottom right there, that little gray box, at the state level, and especially non-market states, many, I'd even go so far as to say most states want their utilities, really looking at the vertically integrated utilities, to be studying storage in integrated resource plans. And when you look around the country, storage is showing up in a number of these plans. There's still a little bit of a learning curve. There's still, many of these utilities are looking at cost curves when it comes to storage. But we CES, we are running plenty of production cost models when it comes to non-market applications of storage being used really as a reliability resource for these load serving entities. So kind of sticking with the markets today, but plenty happening at the state level. Looking at the technology mix, and say this is sort of divided on the same timeline, if you will, I'm going to say that the majority of the activity, and really when you're looking at the interconnection queues, the majority of the activity right now with storage is actually hybrid, is storage co-located specifically with solar. There are plenty of operational benefits that can be cited when it comes to siting storage with renewables. There are plenty of efficiencies gained when it comes to adding storage to, especially an existing site. A lot of the larger IPPs, independent power producers that are out there with large fleets, large portfolios of existing assets. I can't tell you how many times some of these folks have come to me and their exact words are, I can add storage here without even moving the fence around the substation. That is a lot of advantages when it comes to finding sites, environmental permitting, balance of plant, getting the interconnection done. So those efficiencies certainly speak to why so many hybrids these days. But really, when it comes to the economics, the number one thing right now is the solar ITC. When you look at the economics of a project, of a hybrid project, that is by far the biggest impact to the bottom line. So we get the question quite a bit, is that going to shift if a standalone storage ITC finally does get approved? My answer is probably. If something standalone does occur, and if the phase down of the existing ITC does stick, we very well could see a measurable shift in what sort of projects we are seeing in interconnection queues coming to the market. The one other thing I wanted to flag on this slide is something that I don't know that a lot of people necessarily think about, and that's storage batteries paired with fossil resources. We model plenty of this as well. We're actually doing a study with the US Department of Energy right now on storage paired with coal. And really what we're looking at is the operational efficiencies gained, improvement in emissions profiles, when really what we're really doing is decreasing the cycling of these fossil plants and allowing them to run at more optimal heat rates. And GE, for example, has a turnkey out of the box gas turbine plus battery. And they are deploying these resources. So kind of a second thought when it comes to a lot of folks when it comes to hybrids, but it's a very viable business model, really depending on the usage profile of the fossil component of the project. Okay, mention state level activity, IRP planning. Plenty of states out there also implementing storage mandates, storage targets. The state of New York, I believe they just recently doubled that threshold. California, of course, been doing this for some time. We're really expecting this to increase as time moves forward, not necessarily quickly. Like I said, there's still plenty of education and learning and watching cost curves that needs to be done, but this will continue to be a trend. And so opportunities at that state level, so getting projects approved by state commissions, not necessarily going through an organized market where one exists, that's going to continue to be a strategy that the commercial sector continues to evaluate. Okay, speaking of cost curves, now I just heard the collective gasp from everyone watching this right now. Oh my goodness, prices are going up. Not necessarily. I just had our analytics group run these numbers just in the last 12 hours. So first of all, first thing to point out, we didn't have time to clean up the graphs. You'll notice the y-axis axes don't match. The baseline cost for your smaller projects, those 1 megawatt scale, they do start higher than the baseline cost for your larger projects, 100 megawatt scale. So also note the timeline here doesn't start until 2022. If we were to do a back cast, I think the industry is generally familiar with, I mean, really the precipitous cost declines that have been experienced over the last 5 to 10 years. The manufacturing sector, really driven by mobile devices and electric vehicles, the costs have come down, the efficiencies have come down. The energy per unit of space, so the energy density of grid scale batteries, how much battery can I cram into, say, a 40-foot shipping container, those have dramatically improved. So really, the industry definitely experienced that, and that's why we're seeing double-digit gigawatts of storage in interconnection queues right now. So what's going on here? Why the uptick in 2030? This is due to the recent increase in raw materials and inflation. So that's why you're looking at the dynamics we have here right now. We could rerun these numbers 6 months from now. We could rerun these numbers 12 months from now, and these graphs could look very different. We are expecting that the efficiencies and the economies that are being realized, especially in electrochemical batteries, especially in lithium batteries, are going to continue to improve. How exactly that manifests in commercial prices once these things hit the market has yet to be determined. We don't foresee any kind of collapse in raw materials, any kind of collapse in supply chain. We are doing plenty of work with the manufacturing sector in terms of setting up additional factories, especially gigafactories in the US. So this is not to sound a panic alarm. These graphs just sort of reflect some of the dynamics that are taking place in the world right now. And by the way, these are battery only costs. This is not inverters, balance of plant, et cetera, et cetera. This is battery only. Okay. That's it for the background stuff, industry-wide, manufacturing level, et cetera, et cetera. Going to get into what we're seeing in terms of market trends. And again, just a reminder, this is markets with a capital M. This is really looking at ISOs, RTOs within the US. This is not necessarily in order of importance. I'm going to say this is in order of the amount of activity that we're seeing in terms of policy development, and in terms of the projects that specifically the commercial sector are bringing forward, and then the projects that your vertically integrated utilities, sort of your end users and buyers of these projects are also starting to evaluate. So number one on the list, and this is probably more my opinion, not necessarily that of CES, number one on my list is hybrid storage. Like I said, looking around the country, the majority, the quantified majority of projects in interconnection queues are hybrids. The one catch to this is that there are some significant limitations, mostly in terms of metering and settlement capability when it comes to a true hybrid. When I say true hybrid, that is a project where there are two resources or more behind a point of interconnection that are acting as one unit, and really especially in terms of what the market sees and what the market settles, acting as one unit. For true hybrid resources, and specifically for DC coupled resources, you don't really have the metering that can do that yet. So what we're really seeing in the ISOs is everything right now is being treated as co-located. There's two machines behind the point of interconnection, but they register in the market separately. They offer services to the market separately. They are metered separately. They get settled separately, paid, et cetera, et cetera. That is what we have been seeing. And right now, that's kind of really the state of the markets as they stand. So when it comes to storage, there are lots of questions, hybrid storage, sorry. There are lots of questions that need to be asked. As I said earlier, the standing solar investment tax credit, as long as you are charging the associated storage component at least 75% from that solar array, the entire system is going to benefit from the ITC. But what exactly you do with that hybrid plant in terms of a market participation strategy, managing state of charge, having reliability guarantees if you want to clear capacity markets as a capacity resource. The configuration, the sizing, and then the participation strategy are critically important. The money just doesn't show up for a hybrid system just because the investment tax credit is sitting out there. This takes a lot of optimization and a lot of complying with very specific market rules. In terms of the market rules, I actually like to look at ERCOT in terms of how these structures could turn out. And this is not a 2021 thing. This is actually going back to the end of 2020 for ERCOT, but the template is pretty solid. So in ERCOT, effectively what they're saying is for a hybrid resource, if it's a QSE, the qualified scheduling entity in ERCOT, that is so CES is a QSE. So if we're bringing a hybrid storage plant to ERCOT, if we are relying on the storage component to carry the offer, and so that can be in terms of the added nameplate capacity of the hybrid plant. So I'm offering more than just the solar component. I'm offering the additional megawatts that the storage component brings. Or if I am offering ancillary services. There are some markets where you can't even offer ancillary services from renewable or intermittent resources. And so if my offer carries the technical, the functional capability of the battery, then that battery is going to be treated as a battery. Otherwise, the system is going to be treated as an IRR, an intermittent renewable resource. And so and again, this gets down to the strategy, right? That there are certain, you could almost call them market participation benefits that intermittent resources get in markets simply because it's an intermittent resource. It's relying upon the wind blowing or the sun shining. If you're going to use something as dispatchable as storage, your compliance could look very different. The other thing we see in ERCOT, and this is really generally for storage, not just specific to hybrids, ERCOT is allowing QSEs to update economic offer curves to the market, effectively up to the dispatch interval. It's called the SCED interval. So this is really in real time every 5 minutes. This is a lot of flexibility that's being afforded to storage, but it's critical for storage to, one, manage its own state of charge, but two, also reflect that state of charge in terms of its capability to the market. And that can change quite dynamically. And so ERCOT wants to make sure to account for that. The other thing we see in ERCOT is self-limiting facilities. And this is across markets, it's not just Texas. It's kind of reflected of what was put in place with FERC Order 845, which was an interconnection order. Really what we're seeing is the allowance for developers, asset owners, whomever, to install more nameplate capacity behind a point of interconnection than is limited by the interconnection agreement at that point of interconnection. So my interconnection agreement might say 100 megawatts. That's what you were studied for. I've installed my 100 megawatts of wind. Well, I'm going to add another 50 of storage to balance that intermittency, to take advantage of when the wind isn't blowing, whatever it might be. So what markets are allowing is the asset owner to recognize the limitation of what's in that interconnection agreement. And you can do that via hardware, such as the inverter, or you can do that via integration software. And you just need to be able to show, in this case, the ISO, I will not violate that threshold. And you will have compliance issues with that. ERCOT is very specific about it. But this allows for greater utilization of that point of interconnection, perhaps firming up that renewable resource for better capacity accreditation, whatever it may be. So this is another trend that we're seeing, is how to figure out how to get more out of that interconnection agreement without having to generate more generator interconnection study processes and delaying the deployment of really the storage component. Moving over to PJM. So PJM, and really I want to look at kind of the overlay of the Venn diagram here, these inside loops. So closed loop, open loop, can't charge, can charge. That's referring to charging from the grid. And so what some ISOs are looking at is how do they ensure that resources that are trying to leverage the ITC aren't charging from the grid, or if they're not going to charge from the grid, then maybe the ISO doesn't want to study them that way. And it's really the withdrawal of electrons that we're talking about here. Most generator interconnection studies and processes don't think about the withdrawal of electrons. That's load. And so one challenge the commercial sector has run into, and it's really come to head over the past year, is they have an existing project or a project that's in the queue and it's been studied as injection only. And then the developer wants to add storage and the ISO is going, wait a second, you're going to withdraw electrons from the grid. That's not what we modeled. And so there are some ISOs that have provided the allowance of, if you can show us you're not charging from the grid, if you are strictly going to charge from the associated solar array, maybe to take advantage of the ITC, perhaps we don't have to subject you to a whole bunch of other studies and we can keep your project moving. So PJM, that's kind of what they've set up here in terms of closed loop, open loop. California is following a template very similar to what ERCOT has done, especially when it comes to flexibility in terms of updating the status of the resource every 5 minutes. And there are some ancillary service rules in California as well. And then same thing with PJM. California is trying to identify the best way to manage, if you will, resources that are or are not going to be charging from the transmission system. I am not going through this eye chart, I'm just throwing it up there as an example. I've already talked about metering and settlements. And the one thing the ISOs are starting to move to is, okay, especially for these DC coupled systems, how do we do this with just one settlement meter? And so ERCOT specifically has said, we're just going to meter that point of interconnection. And ERCOT staff put it, everything behind that settlement meter at the point of interconnection, that's a black box. We just need quote unquote situational awareness. Well, situational awareness turns out is a lot of data points. And this is telemetry. This is not settlement level data. This is just so that the grid operator, the market operator knows what they have in terms of resource capability in real time to serve load. And so just because you might only need one revenue grade meter, it does not mean that that's all the metering that you're going to have to put into these projects. And note, there are different telemetry points for the hybrid plant injection versus the withdrawal of the storage component of the plant. So this is going to be very complex moving forward in this hybrid space. This is what a project optimization looks like. This is an actual project that we modeled with our software in ERCOT. Now, in this instance, the client came to us and said, we don't even know if we want to go AC or DC coupled. And so that's what we looked at. And so the graphic on the left is the AC coupled system where the storage and solar array can kind of act independently of one another. You still can have charging from the solar array, but really, and especially for ERCOT, an AC coupled system, separate registration for the two assets, you're participating differently. Those little colored boxes at the top of each graphic, those are the services that are being offered and utilized by the market. And the green specifically is RRS, Responsive Reserve Service, pays very well in ERCOT. The storage industry is chasing that very hard right now. When you look to, I apologize, purple is RRS, green is reg. When you look to the graphic on the right, this is where the storage component is just charging from the solar array. And so you see that state of charge is really managed very narrowly based on what's available from the PV system. If you look up, the strategic opportunity in terms of services from the market looks very different. The two highest paying services, responsive reserve and regulation, it's not as dynamic, they're not as heavily utilized. So there's a trade-off. You're capturing the ITC at the federal level. The state of Texas has a REC program, so we're probably monetizing that, but you're not going to be getting as much from the market. This is what that exercise looks like. This is why it's so important. Okay, that's it for hybrids. I think the next biggest thing is, I mean, really generally speaking, just resource accreditation, resource adequacy, capacity markets. I'm going to say across the ISOs, everyone is taking a look at this right now. And one trend that you see is greater granularity, more specificity, and more seasonality when it comes to looking at resource adequacy constructs. And that looks different in each of the ISOs. For example, in California, they've always been pretty granular. They're now looking intraday in terms of sort of valuing the resource adequacy contribution of assets. In MISO, by contrast, they're moving from an annual block of study down to seasons, blocks, almost a quarterly type assessment. They might be able to get down to that level. So it looks different, but really the ISOs are trying to accomplish the same thing. Storage is, in one way or another, it really is part of these conversations across the markets. I think a lot of the markets really are trying to figure it out first with intermittent resources because there is so much seasonal variability when it comes to renewables, but especially especially because of the growth of hybrids, the ISOs are trying to figure out, okay, how do we work storage into this conversation? One thing you are starting to see is ELCC, effective load carrying capability. And really what this is looking at is the contribution towards serving load for a given asset class at an increased penetration level of that asset class. And so the idea is, and again, especially when it comes to intermittence, because you can usually put a reasonably tight fence around what times of day solar is available and what times of day wind is available. And the idea is, if you're not shifting that output, then you're really only going to be able to carry so much of the load at those times, given penetration levels. And after a while, you're going to cross a threshold where more solar or more wind doesn't necessarily carry more load. And so the Southwest Power Pool, SPP, has now applied they're really in the process of applying ELCC to storage. And if you look there on the right, I've just got the little circle around it. As the battery capacity means not capacity of an individual battery. It means penetration levels on the grid. As those penetration levels start to increase, the accreditation of storage as an asset class starts to decrease. Now, as you start to increase the duration of storage, moving from 4 to 6 to 8, you're covering a bigger block of time in the load shape, so your accreditation improves, right? You have far more flexibility. You're providing that service over a greater window, so your load carrying capability goes up. Very similar idea here. This is for PJM, and I did not draw a little circle around it, But if you look to the chart on the right, 4-hour storage, 6-hour storage, 8-hour storage, the accreditation goes up as the duration goes up. Now, the one thing we found pretty interesting here, open loop, closed loop. So charging from the grid, not charging from the grid. Right now, the ELCC values for those are the same. It's going to be interesting to see how that might change moving forward. Really, all the ISOs are saying, look, folks, this is initial. This is all going to change as more of this stuff starts to hit our system. But this is where the regions are going with it. One other graphic to share with you here. This is in California. What you have here is sort of pre-update for solar, pre-ELCC on the left, the blue columns there, post-ELCC on the right. This is not necessarily good news looking at it from the solar perspective. And it just reflects that idea, certain times of year, more solar is just not necessarily going to be that helpful. Now, if it hits during shoulder seasons or during kind of non-peak solar times, the relationship looks vastly different. So these conversations are very important. For storage capacity accreditation, when we were coming out of FERC Order 841, which was the energy storage order, several of the ISOs defaulted to 4 hours. If you have 4 hours of capability, you will qualify for capacity or resource adequacy. D-rating was a requirement of Order 841. So if I only had a 2-hour battery, I could cut my nameplate in half. So if I had a 10 megawatt 2-hour battery, I could qualify for 4 hours of capacity with 5 megawatts over this, so 5 and 5. This was a good thing for storage, 4 hours, very economic number coming off the manufacturing lines, pretty straightforward. Even the Southwest Power Pool, who doesn't run a capacity auction, acknowledged 4-hour storage for resource adequacy accreditation, which an SPP is critical for PPAs, if that's what you're looking for in that market. The ELCC conversations, they're going to change that, right? So we might not necessarily have such a clean 4 hours and you're done in many of these markets. So this is something very strategically we are having to evaluate the timelines of when these accreditation practices might change, might start to be implemented by the markets. Okay, that's it for accreditation. Honorable mention in terms of what's happening in the markets. The first that comes to mind, and you've heard me mention it several times this morning, is interconnection. Generally speaking, interconnection has been rough in the ISOs. There has been a lot of investment, a lot of movement, a lot of projects brought to the queue. Several of the ISOs have gone to FERC and formally filed delays in study clusters, study timelines. California ISO had something like a 200 and something % increase in interconnection requests last year. SPP just had changes to their study process approved by FERC. So interconnection has really impacted the commercial sector. For a hybrid storage, simply because hybrid storage became so important, this is really something the ISOs are trying to figure out. In several of the markets, if you were to add storage to a resource in the queue, you start over again. That is a material modification. That is a new asset. You have to be studied for withdrawals. And they just say, sorry, go to the back of the line. You got to start over again. MISO has come up with a way to fix that. They just filed those tariff changes, I think, towards the latter half of last year. So now, depending on where you are in the study process, you can add storage without necessarily having to start over again. There in some markets, we're working with developers where they are actually, even with a hybrid project, submitting 2 different study processes. They feel like that'll move through the queue faster than trying to study the thing as a true hybrid. So interconnection has been a very big deal, and something worth considering looking back at last year. The other is storage as transmission, or storage. Now, this is not a new thing. You can go all the way back to 2010, Presidio, Texas. I believe that is in AEP, Texas service territory. There was a battery deployed at a substation there just to help manage some of the challenges they were having at that substation. You have the Glacier project for Puget Sound Energy. Really, I mean, it's really storage as acting as wires to keep a critical infrastructure in the town of Glacier online during kind of the frequent winter outages they have up there. The town is buried in the Cascade Mountains. Con Ed's Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. That is the deferral of major upgrades to a substation that would have been needed in downtown Brooklyn. And storage was part of the solution there. It was approved by the state of New York, deregulated market. Con Ed is using a battery, and it's really just the arbitrage utilization of that battery, but they're using it for grid purposes. And so the costs were recovered as a grid resource. It's not being put in the New York ISO. State of Maryland is piloting all of this stuff. They're even looking at their deregulated utilities, possibly leveraging storage in the market to help mitigate some of the cost impact to distribution rates, transmission rates. But what we've really had in terms of the past year is MISO first, the first FERC-approved tariff for a regulated rate of return for storage as transmission. That was a pretty big deal. That was driven by ATC. They brought a project to the MTEP, the MISO Transmission Expansion Plan. This is SATOA, because we always need more acronyms, storage as a transmission only asset. What we're not contemplating right now is dual use, which is using that storage as wires asset and also earning market revenues from it. MISO is actively looking at that right now. And soon up is going to be Southwest Power Pool. They have followed MISO's template for storage as transmission. It's been approved by the MOPSI and SPP. We're probably going to have a FERC filing soon. I'm optimistic for the FERC filing. Like I said, they followed MISO's template, so I'm expecting a reasonably efficient approval process. SPP's got some work to do in terms of getting their systems in check and really providing robust enough data for developers to do this. But same thing in SPP. People are always saying, look, we're going to want to participate in the market with this. We got to look at this. SPP is closely looking at market power that may result from these types of resources. So plenty of questions to be answered, but especially as we start to see so much market saturation is really what it is in terms of energy and ancillary services markets. These capacity accreditation rules have become very important. Long duration storage, we heard Dr. Gyuk mention some of these new technologies. We're talking to manufacturers all the time. We have a storage project that doesn't even become usable unless it's 6 hours or 8 hours. Where are we going? And so that's now a market entry strategy for a lot of folks. And then utility applications and storage as wires. It just provides another avenue by which developers can build projects and earn revenues. So really important to mention those. I am going to end with another very big thing that is hit specifically batteries and especially lithium ion batteries. And that is the life cycle of these resources. And this really follows under the ESG discussions. Dr. Gyuk mentioned those as well. First of all, I don't know that you can respond to a storage solicitation or a storage study, and this is really in international markets. I mean, we look at these things through US TDA and foreign markets all the time. And it really is consistently a requirement now. What is the decommissioning plan? What does end of life look like for these things? What are the channels and opportunities for recycling of the components of electrochemical batteries? Now, depending on the very specific battery chemistry, some of those opportunities are very well established. Some of these chemical components and earth minerals, et cetera, there is a second life for them. There is additional value chain. And so the recycling processes are there. It's not in terms of going in and removing these systems at the end of life. That is not as well established as delivering the systems. But I think the industry will get there. Some of these electrochemical batteries, there really is no second life opportunity in terms of the economics. And so that now becomes a cost for someone. And who bears that cost? Is it the project developer? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the end user, whomever may have bought or is utilizing that system? So that's a question that, first of all, nobody's going to volunteer for that. But that is a question that has to get answered. Going more broadly than just recycling and repurposing is the overall supply chain. And this has become huge with the social focus that is in place in all industries right now, right? I mean, how much energy goes into making a wind turbine? Because then that is now considered part of the overall footprint of wind energy. Well, the same thing is being asked of the components of electrochemical batteries. And really, you're looking at mining and extraction, and not just the environmental and ecological impact of mining and extraction, but who's actually doing this? What sort of labor laws and labor practices are in place in a lot of the countries that lead the way in terms of mining? And then there's the manufacturing and production of those minerals as they start to become usable batteries, so to speak. And there's, again, social constructs there, there's political relationships, risks to supply chain. For the most part right now, all of this stuff is predominantly mined in one part of the world, and it is manufactured in another part of the world. And if there's one thing that we're really still experiencing right now is when you rely on one channel for supply chain and that channel gets held up or interrupted, it can greatly impact prices and cost curves. And that's what we had in our cost curve graph at the very beginning of this. So this recycling, repurposing, closed loop economies, all this become very important when it comes to the battery sector. And it's also getting folks to look outside of just electrochemical batteries, more inert type platforms, water-based platforms. That this is going to become a major part of the discussion moving forward when it comes to the evaluation of technologies for a given project. It's not just going to be cost, it's not just going to be performance, it's going to be life cycle as well. I'm going to leave it at that, making sure to leave some time for some questions here from the audience. So thanks again to CESA for the opportunity. There is my contact information if anyone would like to reach out and follow up. And with that, Val, I have a feeling I'm probably turning it over back to you.
Thanks, John, and thank you for that very thorough presentation and for closing us out with some thought-provoking questions to consider regarding lithium mining and the equity and environmental issues associated with the technology. So, audience, please feel free to type in your questions using the question dialog box. I've got a couple queued up myself, and I see that a couple have come in. So I wanted to go back to the beginning to both you, John, and also to Dr. Gyuk. Any new potential technologies that might compete with lithium ion that have popped up over this past year and that you see having potential in the next few years? Imre, I believe in your introduction you mentioned flywheels, other technologies. I can't hear either of you, so I don't know. There we go. Can't hear you yet. Let's see.
Okay, how is that?
There we go. Perfect.
Yeah, other technologies are being investigated very actively. As I mentioned, for medium duration storage, particularly flow batteries. And there's a whole host of potential flow batteries there involving the earth abundant materials, sulfur, iron, manganese, what have you. And then for longer duration storage, above 12 hours, 12 to 3 hours, there is gravity storage. You can pile cement blocks on top of each other, or run small carts up a hill. Ares does that. Or you have various thermal storage methods, usually using phase change materials. For example, you can do it hot, and you can use the phase change of molten aluminum. If you use recycled aluminum, that's a plus. Or you can use liquid air at the other end of the temperature spectrum. And liquid air is obviously cheap too, and it's a technology we know well. So there's a host of technologies that are being worked at very actively. There are commercial entries already, and a few pilot plants. California Energy Commission, for example, gets kudos, but still the majority of applications is in the less than 4 hours and lithium ion as a technology.
And speaking of, oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was just going to piggyback on some of that. Yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of the application and the business case, duration is the big question right now, with so much focus shifting towards resource adequacy as most grids start to move more and more away from fossil resources. In terms of the platform, I'm going to agree with definitely flow batteries. We're seeing more of those coming out, and this is not an endorsement. I just mention these guys mostly because they're right here in my backyard in Colorado. Lockheed Martin coming out with a flow battery right now. It's manufactured in Massachusetts. The reason why I mention them is because you're not talking about a company here that's looking for angel funding to come to the market, right? And the size of the balance sheet, the firmness and financial capabilities of the entity bringing these resources to the market is very important to the market. So when you have someone like a Lockheed bringing flow batteries out, that speaks pretty loudly too. So definitely a platform that's gaining a lot of steam.
Just to throw in a few more names to be more impartial, there's Largo working with California Energy Commission. There is that's Invinity working with California Energy Commission. Largo is working with the manufacturing office in DOE, and Honeywell is coming up with a new technology as well.
Great point. I slept on them. Yep.
And you both mentioned long duration energy storage being something you're going to keep your eye on for the future. We'll see how things change. Do you see, I know lithium ion batteries have just pushed the 8-hour duration mark. Do you see continued growth and opportunity for lithium ion batteries to compete in long duration, or are we looking to other technologies or a spectrum?
I would look mostly to other technologies. If you do 8 hours in lithium ion, you are pushing it. We have done projects 8 hours, for example, a project on Nantucket Island, where we have used 8 hours of storage for lithium ion, or rather the National Grid has. But the 4 hour and less than 4 hour is really the ideal application for lithium ion.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I mean, I think lithium is going to keep competing for a while simply because of the scale of manufacturing that's there, and that's how they're going to keep their costs down. But in terms of performance, as you start to see more investment in these other technologies, you probably will see a shift, or at least a more competitive playing field once you pass that 8-hour threshold.
Thank
We're
you.
certainly going to see lithium ion for the next 10 years.
Great. I appreciate those responses. I know this is a 2021 in review webinar, and I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball. We have some more crystal ball questions coming at you, but let me switch gears a little bit. And John, I wanted you to revisit your presentation. You mentioned coal and storage. And I wondered if you could, one, clarify a few things, talking about who's exploring this. Can a coal, let's say a coal plus storage system, collect the ITC? And what are the climate, health, equity concerns regarding a coal, a fossil fuel, and storage?
Yeah, great questions. And so, no, there is no tax credit to be gained from pairing storage with coal. Really looking at, so who is looking at this? It's not coal developers. This is not going to be bringing, it's not going to bring a wave of new coal to the system. We're really talking about existing assets. We're talking about existing owners that have these resources still in their portfolios, let's say for another number of years. I don't even know how much coal is going to be left after 10 years. So let's keep it inside that timeline. There's an economic side to the story. You know, right now, coal plants, perhaps they're having trouble participating in ancillary services market and catching revenues from things like frequency regulation, which pays really well, but typically has some pretty strict performance requirements, especially as some markets start to move to faster and faster AGC signals. So coal simply just has to stand by and watch. And so what you might do now, and on the other side of that, you have very short duration batteries that are extremely good at participating in frequency regulation. But there is risk, and there's risk for the grid operator. And we saw this last February in Texas for some of these ancillary services. Really, you're looking at, let's say, just an hour, maybe even 30 minutes when it comes to an ancillary service requirement. But sometimes these requirements, we call the signal pegs, or it drifts in one direction. And if you're participating with a 1 hour battery, you all of a sudden find yourself out of capability. And so the strategy isn't really economic. So from an economics perspective, you pair a very short duration battery with a coal plant. The battery follows the regulation signal when it's very dynamic. If the signal pegs, the fossil plant jumps in and picks it up. So you maintain you stick with your obligation to the market. And then once that signal changes direction with regulation, the battery jumps back in. So that's the economic side, works out pretty well. There is actually a social and environmental gain from this. And I think that's what gets overlooked a lot. If you allow these projects to, one, decrease their cycling and run at their optimum heat rate, typically you are improving the emissions profile. Mm-hmm. And so it's very counterintuitive when you say to someone, I can pair a battery with a coal plant and make it more environmentally sound. They go, what? If you improve the use of the fossil plant, chances are you improve the emissions.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me pick up on fossil fuel generating plants. So a question has come in. A fossil fuel generating plant owner in Massachusetts has indicated that it will lose its injection rights if they were to pursue outright replacement of that generation versus hybridization with storage. Is this specific to ISO New England or common in other markets? And can you think of any regulatory or other changes that could address this barrier?
Definitely not unique to New England, and this is what has created some of the headaches for really the ISOs. And it's not the fault of anyone. It's just how these processes were put in place years ago when you didn't have this much variability in fleets. You didn't have so much turnover in assets and really so much pressure for asset owners to convert fossil plants to something else, something more efficient, something renewable. The loss of injection rights, that is a big deal. And that is it's very hard to get injection rights. It can be very hard to have, any kind of FTR, financial transmission right, you also might have when it comes to a point of interconnection. And so there's a balancing act here to be done in terms of offering the flexibility to the commercial sector, let's say the asset owner, it doesn't necessarily need, it could be utilities, the asset owner to make these conversions make these improvements to efficiencies, et cetera, letting them do it expeditiously without high cost, without losing all of the rights they may have at that point of interconnection, which are very valuable, but at the same time allowing a fair and reasonable and reliable study process when it comes to generators and changing generators. Adding storage to something is not the same as having a static type resource that just very predictably injects electrons to the grid around the clock. It looks very different to a grid operator. And so it's the lag here is, and I mean, if I had the answer, we wouldn't have delays in the interconnection queue. I would have got paid a whole lot of money to tell everyone the answer, and I'd be retired not even doing this today. But that's not the case. It's really trying to figure this out, especially with all the different study processes you see across the ISOs. It's a very long answer here because it's not straightforward. So hopefully I've somewhat answered that question, Val.
Thank you. All right, let me move on to some more audience questions. We're delving into some acronyms that are unfamiliar for me. So, is Southwest Power Pool 4, SATOA, looking at allowing only transmission operators to own and operate, as in MISO? And maybe you could clarify for myself and perhaps for others, SATOA.
Yeah, so SATOA is storage as a transmission only asset.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That's what the ISOs are saying. Right? We're not touching dual use. We're not touching market participation because there's a lot of complexities that have to do with that. So this question has to do with what was approved in MISO. In MISO, to get cost recovery for storage as transmission, you're going through attachment O. Attachment O is open to transmission companies, capital T, capital C. There is a lot that an entity has to go through to become a transmission company. If it's a commercial entity, there's NERC requirements, there's NERC standards of conduct, there's registration, there's all kinds of stuff to go through. Also in MISO, distribution companies might want to propose some of these projects as well. You can deploy storage at distribution and show a transmission level benefit. Problem is the distribution companies, per state law, aren't allowed to become capital T, capital C transmission companies. So this actually got all the way to the District Court of Appeals with MISO. They never touched it, still hasn't been resolved. We're still moving forward with attachment O. I haven't read the fine print of what's coming out in SPP. My guess it's going to be something very similar. I don't know if SPP, because if you're not going to go that route, you have to come up with a new section of the tariff that allows for non-transmission companies to be able to get transmission cost recovery. That a lot of lawyers get called either way. So I'm going to say I'm not sure what's in place specifically, what's going to move forward into FERC with SPP. My guess it would be not a whole new section of the tariff.
Thank you. Another crystal ball question. So, for total megawatt hours of energy storage that will be installed in the US over the next 5 years, what percent do you see as a hybrid solution? For example, with solar versus a standalone?
That's yours, John.
So when you look, so I mean, we could figure this out. We could do the math. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the numbers are. In ERCOT right now, mostly because of some of the value that can be gained from, especially that RRS service, there's a lot of standalone storage in the queue, simply because there's money to be made. There's also a very high level of saturation and proration risk in the ERCOT market right now, with all this standalone storage. So I don't know how long that's going to last. MISO, you're kind of looking at 50-50. PJM in California, I think the vast majority is solar plus storage. So I'm going to just roll the dice and say half. Half is going to be hybrid, half is going to be standalone. Recognizing if that standalone storage ITC hits, those numbers, at least in the queue, could change very dramatically.
Okay. All right. another clarifying question. And it might be helpful to go back to your accreditation slides, but can you explain accreditation in the storage context?
Yeah, so generally speaking, accreditation is, I mean, you can almost use it interchangeably with qualification. And so when you get capacity or resource adequacy accreditation, at the end of the day, it's just how many megawatts are you going to get paid for, right? And so it's almost like it's kind of similar to capacity factor when it comes to wind or solar. So just because I'm installing nameplate 100 megawatts of an intermittent resource, I might not be getting paid for that full 100, right? Because you're not getting 100% of that nameplate around the clock. So accreditation really reflects that. And so if you're bringing something like storage to the market, if you're just going with a straight 4-hour accreditation process, if you will, then if I install 100 megawatts of storage and I have 4 hours of capability, I can bring 100 megawatts of the capacity auction and get cleared and paid for 100 megawatts. What ELCC is saying is at a certain penetration level, that 100 megawatts is not, at 4 hours, is not going to be worth as much. And so you might only get valued at 80 megawatts or 60 megawatts. And so then your capacity value and ultimately resulting in what you could get paid for, what you could sign in a PPA, that's going to go down respectively.
Thank you, that was very helpful. All right, I've got a couple of market questions for you. Any ISOs where energy storage can do both time shifting and ancillary services? And then the second one, I'll put them both out at the same time. Do you see duration requirements for capacity markets increasing? And if so, where? And crystal ball question, when?
So shifting and ancillary services. I'm going to say shifting is really, I don't want to use the term just, but it's energy, right? There's no ISO out there where I'm going to the day ahead auction and saying, here's my 100 megawatts of shift. There's no such thing. You do have ramping products in the ISOs. You might have utility level time of use type structures. California really gets into intraday and intra-hour granularity. But I mean, really, when you're talking about shift, you're talking about the arbitrage value. And that just goes into managing state of charge, buying low, selling high. That's the participation strategy. Can you do energy and ancillaries at the same time? Yes, you can. Many of the markets you can. Because you can just do one or the other if you want. Some of them differ from what you have to offer day ahead to what you have to offer real time. A lot of that is up to the market itself, how they run their day ahead to real time scheduling and then settlement. The second question, do I see duration requirements going up in the ISOs? I think, I guess the answer might be sort of yes, but it's going to be because of that ELCC requirement. And so it's, or I'm sorry, ELCC calculation. So it's not so much the requirement that's going up, it's just going to be your accreditation or your capacity value and payment that you're going to get with a longer duration system. We're starting to see the ISOs moving away from just this static, you get 100% at 4 hours. I think New York has more of a sliding scale, so much at 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. So I think that's what we're gonna see. So kind of yes, kind of no. In terms of when, immediately. All this stuff is going into place right now. It's the trend you're gonna see for the next few years.
On the first question, by the way, demand charges in particular are very easy to pair with other things like frequency regulation or arbitrage.
Great point, and that very much is a shifting concept, right? So when you get down to kind of that retail level, yeah, excellent addition. Thanks, Dr. Gyuk. Good point.
All right, we can't get away from the hydrogen questions. So here is one. What about energy storage by making hydrogen or ammonia with surplus renewable power and then using the hydrogen in a fuel cell? What are the opportunities for hydrogen as an energy storage technology? We touched upon this a little bit in our first question.
Well, as a first cut, that process wastes a lot of energy. So if you're going to use surplus renewable energy, you want to make sure it's really surplus no matter how you count it. So you have to take into account, for example, how much energy went into making the windmills, for example. It's not just a question that wind is free and so you can have any amount of wind and you just make a lot and then you put it into your hydrogen. I see hydrogen perhaps mainly in the transportation field, where you can't use wires, planes, for example. I'm really worried about what happens a lot with natural gas. You lose some to the atmosphere, effect on the upper atmosphere. You know, do you get more ultraviolet into hitting us? These are questions which are not entirely resolved. But yeah, certainly ammonia and hydrogen will play.
Ditto to all of that. Really well said. In terms of an energy resource, a storage construct, yeah, it's technically possible. It's just not very efficient right now. We really see the hydrogen being used for other applications. There was an announcement, I think recently, Apex Clean Energy is looking to have dedicated, probably wind, mostly wind, down in Texas, to send that hydrogen down to the ports of Texas to be used for other purposes. Otherwise, I don't see enough unused renewable energy at given points, at least around the United States, that can be used to run electrolysis. I agree with Dr. Gyuk. It's just not there right now.
And hydrogen leaks through everything, including steel pipes.
Yep. Yeah, the transport and Dr. Gyuk, please, this is my perception. I mean, the transport of hydrogen, yes, it can be used in the given infrastructure. I do believe it has different corrosive properties. I know you can treat existing infrastructure and all that, but you make a good point. I mean, you're talking about a very small element here, a very small molecule, and so it's going to leak out of anything that might be there. So that is, again, loss of efficiencies that someone's going to need to address.
Thank you.
And remember San Bruno. If it had been hydrogen rather than gas leaking out and catching fire, it might have been very impressive.
All right, we've got another crystal ball question. What are your guesses on a federal tax credit for standalone storage? Will it pass?
I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, this has been floating out there for a while. The U.S. Energy Storage Association has been working really hard on this. There's a lot of positive talking points. There is a lot of interest. I'll just speak from CES's perspective. We don't model it in our baseline models. We can certainly model it as a potential, as a potential variable, a scenario. That's the word I was looking for. But until it's there, it's just not something we really contemplate when we evaluate the economics of a resource.
Yeah. As a personal opinion, if any technology merits a tax credit, storage should. If not now, then eventually, because sooner or later we're going to need much more storage of much longer durations, where it's going to be difficult to have a business case.
Okay, thank you. We're winding down on the questions. There have been recent lithium-ion price increases. What magnitude in terms of percentage have these increases been?
John, you track those?
Yeah, and I think you saw a little bit in the slide that I flashed earlier. You know, it's kind of flattening out those projected cost curves, maybe going up a little bit under the current state of supply chain and such. I don't know those raw numbers for lithium itself off the top of my head, but I mean, we do get asked quite a bit, and especially just reflecting, it's mined in one place, it's manufactured in one place. Really, and a lot of times when people talk about the availability of these minerals, it's the cobalt. Actually, it's not the lithium. So it's front of mind and legitimately so, but we are not projecting any kind of major impact to the prices that would have a measurable dampening effect on the industry itself. We're not seeing that.
Well, and we've talked about some market changes, regulatory changes, some state policies that have driven market growth in the last couple of years. But how about fires and other issues, recent issues? How are they impacting storage procurement and the storage market?
Well, it's definitely a consideration, and that's why we run a reasonably sized safety program at the Department of Energy. And by the way, we are going to have a safety and reliability conference coming up in May. You're invited to it. It's going to be free if virtual, and I don't know what it will be otherwise. But yes, safety is a consideration. In particular, both of the really big installations like Moorabool and Moss Landing have shown problems with heating some of the battery components, and they had to go offline because they were just not safe for a while.
Yeah, I mean, again, Wilson, I don't know that I would add. The only thing I would add is just not critically important. And as you just heard, there's a lot of work going into it, a lot of education. I know developers they actually spend a lot of time educating municipal fire departments on what to do with this thing if something does falter. But not something we're seeing, again, putting any kind of downward pressure on the industry.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes the Q&A portion of the webinar and the webinar itself. We do have some announcements regarding future webinars. Sam, if you want to throw up that slide while I again thank Dr. Gyuk and John Fernandez for speaking with us and taking the time today for some excellent presentations and great Q&A. Upcoming webinars, we are hosting an energy storage webinar series with the Connecticut Green Bank. So the first and the last two bullets reference 3 upcoming webinars on Connecticut energy storage that we're hosting in partnership with the Connecticut Green Bank, and then a CESA webinar, Introduction to Power Markets, on the 11th. You can find information and register at cesa.org/webinars. That is everything for today. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.